Hi everybody, Billy here. This is Antioch, Chapter 5, The Grace. A terrible storm had just passed. The Grace rested at sea, and someone was knocking on Andolin's door. She brought her head out of the basin between her knees, her short blonde hair clumped from sweat, and her face nearing green. She couldn't have said which was worse right then, seasickness or the rot. Her cabin smelled of sour milk. She resolved to stop vomiting long enough to see who was knocking. The worst of it was over anyway. She'd been in dry heaves for a while by then, and if someone was at her door, it could only mean trouble. Andolin did not receive social calls. She put on a pair of black rubber goggles and tied a surgeon's cover over her nose and mouth. Then she opened the door to a fiery sunrise and a tall person wearing a gas mask that had the look of a startled walrus. The mask also muffled his speech. "Wong-manug!" Andolin hooded her eyes under the goggles. "Drake, take it off." He did. Thump! A chipper 19-year-old with big teeth. "We found it!" Drake. She wasn't in the mood for his gobbledygook routine or his bad jokes. "Is Biggs in there with you?" He tried to poke his head in to take a look. She blocked him, clenched her teeth, and barked, "Drake!" He jumped back. "No, seriously, Captain sent me. Everyone's on deck. We found it. We're there, or we're here. You know what I mean." She stepped out to empty her basin over the guardrail. The ship's lanes were compact, blocky, and wood-grain. One crewman and then another squeezed past. Drake bounced away with them, stuffing his head back into the mask. Andolin's stomach jumped. He is not joking. She ducked inside, holstered on a pair of revolvers, and then hurried to the front of the ship. 50 people, the entire crew, crowded the deck, wearing all kinds of goggles and respirators. They watched the horizon with telescopes, binoculars, and unrestrained excitement. Captain looked out over the water through the big scope on his bolt-action rifle, an M1903 Springsteen Boss, bearing optimized sniper system. He wore a luxuriously purple calf-length coat. Wisps of wavy auburn hair trailed from the gauze cocooning his head. Andolin went to stand next to him at the rail. A sailor on her other side, not realizing who had just moved in, put his hand on her shoulder and said, "Can you believe it? We're finally—" Then he saw her face, the goggles and surgeon's cover, and took his hand away. "Oh, sorry." He left, wiping that hand on his shirt. Andolin watched him go. She said, "I am here, Captain." Her voice had the volume and confidence of a public speaker. Shielding her eyes from the sun, she followed the crowd's attention to a thin strip of land in the distance. Captain spoke in a nautical drawl while concentrating on his aim. "I've heard you're bringing up your guts again. Thought you're over that." Drake was on the other side of him, giving Andolin the thumbs up. She hooded her eyes at him again. "I did not do well during the storm." Captain said, "Despicable tempest. We could have been here yesterday to be true." He turned to face her, stray hair, goggles, and gauze making his head look like a steaming robotic egg. "If Zeke's points are right, port's around the bend." He sounded like he was smiling. The crew buzzed with anticipation. They manned their stations to bring the ship around, and even as they worked the rigging, couldn't look away from the coast. Then, there it was, Moreau. Cheers erupted from the deck. Captain balled his ebon fist triumphantly. "This is it! I know it!" He handed Andolin his rifle. "Take a look at that! Those backward little shacks are beautiful." Shouldering the stock, she aimed at a cluster of cottages that dotted the steep incline of a small natural harbor. Long piers branched out high over the water and blended into the town's wood-plank pavement. They were slim strips meant for fishing, not for docking ships. Andolin said, "I do not see any people." Captain said, "No, and it sits a bit shallow for the Grace, but that's not the first thing I'd say." He opened a split in his mask to take his pipe's bit in his teeth. Then he drew a gnarly, homemade match out of a box from his coat pocket and struck it on the guardrail. It snapped, flared, and spat brief little fireballs, and hissed like torn parchment. When it calmed to a flame, he lit the pipe and flicked the matchstick into the sea. A murmur was spreading among the crew from another discovery. Andolin said, "There is a ship farther east along the coast. It appears to have been beached." Smoke curled from Captain's gauze. "Why?" "We might should leave her out and drop the dinghy then." Andolin handed the rifle back and said to Drake, "Gather the others. Prepare to land." Drake saluted. "Wong Mong!" They both hurried away. Captain took aim at the distant shipwreck. With mixed feelings over what was on the horizon, he spoke to no one but himself. "No need to hurry now. We've nowhere else to be." Andelin sat at the dinghy's prow with her back to their destination, watching the Grace as they rowed away. Its 3 tall masts were draped in ropes and pulleys like a spiderweb on blades of grass. A black metal furnace hung on chains from the spars over one side instead of a lifeboat. The crew called it the coffin. The glow from its grate gave it a lantern's quality. The coffin, the Grace, and the dinghy each rocked and swayed in their own rhythm. Andelin's nausea returned, and she closed her eyes. 6 others sat in the small boat with her. They served as the ship's marines. When it was necessary to go ashore, they were the ones who went. They were an improvised group that agreed to abide by a harsh code of law they called the system. They hadn't been ashore in a long time. Drake pulled an oar, merrily honking nonsense through his mask. "Mung wungagung, gunga wumma mungamung." Ditch said, "Shut up, dummy." He pulled the other oar. Under skimpy swimmer's goggles and a bivalve respirator, Ditch was small, bald, and tattooed. His stiff leather jacket and cargo pants jingled and chuffed as he rowed. Biggs laid back with his legs crossed, an easy-going country boy. At least you can't tell what he's on about in that thing. He wore a dangly strapped diver's mask and had a bandana pulled over his nose like an outlaw. Ditch spoke rapidly. "Man, that's why it sucks, 'cause I get, curious. I know what he's saying is duped. I know it. But then I start wanting to know how duped, you know?" Biggs chuckled. "Suppose." Drake pumped his fist. "Wum gung. Mung wumma gumma." Ditch said, All right. Shut up for real. We're getting close." Wells watched Moreau through his binoculars all the way in. He said, "I keep hoping someone will just walk out and wave." He sounded like that hope was fading. Ditch said, "Yeah, man, I used to do that too." The wind followed them in from the sea, and no one spoke above a whisper. They moored at the deep end of a long pier, and rifles and gear slung on their backs took turns creeping up the creaking ladder. On the other side of the harbor, beneath the level of the boards and across a forest of pilings, a ghoul shuffled unnoticed into the water toward them. Andelin scanned inland with a spyglass. The doors and windows of the cottages closest to shore were open and broken. It was silent aside from the water lapping at their thumping boat. Biggs looked up. No gulls. Ditch sighed. This place is gone, man. It discouraged them all. Moreau was supposed to be the end of the road, the end of their troubles. It was supposed to be safe. Andelin said, "We have the wind at our backs. This is an adequate position. We should take advantage of it and begin clearing immediately." The other sailors mumbled and shifted. Biggs backed her up. "Everything else is where Zeke said it'd be. Road north ought to take us straight to Antioch then, right? Shoot. That's probably where most of these folks got to." He put his hand on Wells' shoulder. "Ain't never gonna have to do this again, y'all." They always responded better to him. Weapons clicked and clacked in their unanimous resolution. Andelin said, "Outstanding. Drake has the bag." Drake slumped. "Munga wawa munga mug." Ditch mocked him with a dopey whine. "Why do I always have the bag?" And then brushed by him with a little bit of a shove. "'Cause you shot Biggs last time you were on the line, stupid." Biggs said, "It's all right, Goober," and consoled him with a pat as he moved past. The line, 5 riflemen kneeling in a row, leveled their weapons at the land's end of the pier. Drake crouched behind them and unzipped the bag, a hefty olive-green cylinder filled with a nest of cartridges, each one as long and thick as a man's finger, pointed and brass. Drake set out 5-shot stripper clips to reduce the line's loading time. They only had 6 of those clips, and he put the extra next to Biggs. Andelin stood beside Drake, looking out over their heads. When he gave her the thumbs up, she pulled down her surgeon's cover, cupped her hands to her mouth, and called out, "Ahoy!" The message was loud, clear, and saved a bullet. Silence had been broken. They didn't need to whisper anymore. Wells shook out his nerves and said, "Not us." Each of them said it. "Not us." And they waited. 2 figures staggered into view 200 yards away. Andelin inspected them with her spyglass and was surprised. These are young. Somewhat encouraging, the young were slower and easy to hit. She called out the target order. 12! 11! 12 o'clock was dead ahead. 5 violent reports stuttered from their ready weapons. The ghoul at 12 o'clock jerked and twitched in the whizzing bullets, lost balance, and dropped to its hands and knees. Then it brought up one foot and tried to stand. The riflemen lifted and pulled their bolts with fluid clicks. Empty cases spun smoking from the chambers to make way for new rounds. The bolts slid home again, and then more roaring blasts. Debris exploded out of the distant monster. It crumbled, motionless. The line was dialing in. Biggs cried, "Down!" the signal to switch targets to the 11 o'clock zombie. They focused on one at a time and couldn't settle for flesh wounds. They had to hit the head. All of them were accurate shooters with a Springsteen boss. It was an accurate weapon, but they strove for speed in addition to that. Ditch was pretty good. He could hit a 6-inch target at 100 yards every 7 seconds. Biggs could put 5 rounds through an apple at that range in under 15. Before Ditch chambered his 3rd round, the 11 o'clock zombie's head detonated. Down! The others whistled and hooted in appreciation of the shot. A boss with a boss. I'm just going to put mine down. Biggs is the man. Biggs said, "Listen up. Lynn's calling him." 1, 12, 11. They tore the ghouls apart. The last to the left hadn't taken 10 steps before it fell, and Biggs called, "Down!" for the 5th time. The sailors reloaded, staying tense. They'd only begun to clear. If large groups appeared, or a small group of older ones, the odds could quickly force them to retreat. Drake fumbled with the spent stripper clips. Once the line was firing at full speed, and every shot started in the bag, it would become a challenge just to keep Biggs in bullets. The bag was a chaotic position under pressure, with desperate hands grasping at the slick cartridges. Drake dropped them even under ideal conditions, such as right then. One hit the wood and rolled behind him. When he turned around to get it, he saw a rotten arm jutting up from where the ladder met the pier. "Wongamong! Gum!" He slapped at Andolin's rear. She shot a frown at him, and then her face twisted at the wet, quivering thing that was pulling itself onto the boards, coming out of its skin like a molting insect. Its smoke bled into their company on the wind from the sea. Andolin raced toward it, shouting, "Hold your breath! Hold your breath! 6! 6! She stomped on its arm to hold it in place, pulled her right hip's revolver, and emptied it into the ghoul's face. The blast splattered rancid flesh and ink. She fired until she felt the thing relax, and then took her weight away. It fell as a limp corpse, careening off the ladder before splashing into the water below. She was trembling, reloading, and still holding her breath when she heard someone cough. Andolin turned, and her eyes went wide under the gore-speckled goggles. It was Biggs. She said, "Biggs? Biggs?" She couldn't believe it. Everyone stared at him. Ditch became so upset he almost threw his rifle off the pier. "Come on! Swimming, climbing ladders, whatever, man!" The smoke burrowed into Biggs' mouth and throat like tiny cactus spines. He sighed and shook his head. It made sense to him that he'd catch it then, just when he'd started wanting to live again. It was fine. If he stayed calm, he'd have an hour, maybe 2. He'd use it to do what he could for his friends. Biggs looked back at Andolin, the goggles and surgeon's cover, the face of death. When one of them caught the rot, that mask tended to be the last thing they saw. He said, "It's in deep. Gonna ride it out, all right?" She nodded, in a strange way, like she'd lost her balance. He turned and pumped his index finger at Moreau. "Stay on it." Grim, they leveled their rifles again. Andolin remained at the ladder to look out over their heads. Her strong voice broke when she said, 12! 1! That is the end of Chapter 5. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can follow the link at the top of my website, www.williameharlan.com, and purchase the full novel from Amazon in ebook format for $2.99 or as a paperback for $12.99. Thanks for listening. Tune in next week for Chapter 6, Devil's Mark.